we're gonna be taking a look at all the basics and tips and tricks plus shortcuts for beginners. I think there's a lot of handy dandy features that you should know about Ableton. If you know these basics, this is gonna help you tremendously when you're watching other tutorials or my tutorials. You might have bought Ableton because you are a massive EDM nerd like most of us, but you don't have any past experience handling softwares like this. You might be a person who knows their way around music but struggles to barf their ideas into the DAW. I'll help with that. This here is Ableton. Ableton is my DAW of choice because it's easy to understand and really organized, which I really like. Hear me out though. A lot of people choose FL Studio to their first DAW. I did too, but if you're anything like me, you'll enjoy Ableton more in the long run. FL by default is a massively multi-window software which can be really confusing and intimidating at first when you don't know any shortcuts or why X button does Y action. Let's hop into Ableton real quick. When you first open up Ableton, it should look something like this. I'm gonna zoom the display so we can see it better. Okay, first order of business, we want to go into options, then preferences down below. Inside here, there's a couple of neat features that you ideally want to turn on or off. First, in the look and feel tab, you can set your themes. I highly suggest to use something that is easy on the eyes and that you like working on long term. There are a bunch of tools out there where you can create your own themes, which is pretty neat. My theme of choice is mid-dark on 200% brightness. That is something I used for a long time and it's comfortable for me, so. One small little detail is that I use grid line intensity on 200% so I can see my grid easier. Let's hop into the audio tab. In the audio tab, you can set your audio recording and playback devices. I never owned an Apple computer, so I don't know about those instances, but for Windows, you have the MME/DirectX by default. This is good for people who stream their screen a lot on Discord, for example, or Zoom, but it's really buggy. In my experience, on my PC at least, it's really stuttery if I set the buffer size anything lower or higher than 2048. For those of you who don't know, audio buffer is basically the set amount of time shown in samples that the audio engine takes to render your sound. You can set this manually on all drivers pretty much, but make sure to choose the right one because if your machine is not strong enough, for example your CPU is some extremely low tier one, sound might start to sound weird and crackly under load especially. You don't have to worry about the other parameters for now in here. The default should be just fine. However, if you want a more stable and higher quality experience, you should download an AGO for all driver. This here is the AGO for all website. You can download it if you want to, but let's hop back into Ableton and let me explain what it does. AGO for all driver is much better overall, but depending on your Windows version, you can still run into a couple of issues such as not having audio outside your DAW even when that feature is turned on, which is hella weird. One little note here, I highly recommend getting an entry-level audio interface because the drivers that come with those are far superior. Just to name a few entry-level audio interfaces, I have good experience with the Arturia mini series. It's really cheap and it's really high quality. If you want to get something more expensive or higher quality, you should definitely check out the UAD Apollo Solo or Duo. These are much better build quality, much better customer service, and they come with their own plugins. Me personally, I use a Scarlett 2i2, the 4th generation USB variant, because this has a loopback feature which I use a lot recording games, videos, anything like that, because you can loop the output back to itself and you can basically record Windows audio highest quality. So this is why I chose this. Disclaimer time. There's a common misconception about audio interfaces that they free up a lot of CPU power. That's totally false. An audio interface won't pull the load off your PC. It will just make your audio signal flow cleaner and more controlled. Performance is solely dependent on your CPU. If you don't use an audio interface, and you have speakers, for example, you might hear some buzzing noise, some hissing, any type of crackling. That's usually because the cables are not shielded well and the built-in chip on the motherboard is not shielded properly, so they pick up all sorts of noises from the CPU and the power supply. It's a mess. If you want to install third-party plugins later, you should make a separate folder somewhere on your PC and add it to Ableton under the plugins folder. In the same tab, you can also set the plugin window like I did. This way you can have multiple third-party plugin instances open and they won't automatically close when you switch to a different channel. This is really handy. For instance, you have a couple of analyzer plugins down on your master and you want to see what you do on other channels on an EQ or on an oscilloscope or on a stereo imager even. I meant to show the plugin window here, not the library one, sorry. You can copy my settings from this tab. Some of the more notable features here that you have to know is the warp/loop section, where you can set the default behavior of imported audio files. Warping means changing the length/timing of a sample. Looping means it will repeat on the end of the clip when you make it longer instead of just simply ending. The default warp mode should be Complex Pro, but that is still not available by default, so for some reason we are still stuck with Complex. Auto fade clip edges prevents clicky sounds when you cut audio, but every time you import a sample, such as a kick drum or any kind of percussive sample, it also adds the fades. So you really have to keep this in mind, because it can be a real head scratcher when your drums don't hit and you just don't know why. And after 2 hours of editing and adding post-processing, you realize you just had clip fades turned on and you forgot. So we finally made it to the main screen. Basically, there are 4 main sections in this screen. On your left, you'll see the finder where you can search for anything: effects, samples, MIDI files, old project files, anything. The shortcut for searching instantly is Ctrl+F. Press that and then immediately start typing what you're after, such as a compressor or a bass loop or anything that you want. You can even look for preset names such as snare reverb, and it will give you a snare reverb if you saved anything like that. By default, it will search everywhere, but you can click on categories if you want to narrow it down. In the middle, there's your timeline. You can see the bars up top. This is the measurement used in music, bars and beats. In EDM, there's usually a 4 on the floor beat. That means each bar consists of 4 equally long segments, hence the name quarter note rhythm. The rhythm of these type of tracks is mostly 1 bar per beat, so 4 times in a bar. On the right, you have your channels, where you have a track name, a track number, which can be used as an on-off toggle, a channel volume, a balance, and return track faders. But we don't have those because I already deleted them because I don't use them, and you probably shouldn't too. And it will most likely just confuse you at the beginning. So up here, you also have 2 little buttons, one of which is the toggle automation view, which there's a shortcut for it, which is A. If you press A or press that button, you can disable and enable automation view. What this means is you can automate almost every parameter inside a plugin. When that happens, you'll see red lines. Those red lines are basically just telling you the automation of a certain parameter. For example, I'm just gonna quickly show you. If I have automation enabled, you can click a parameter or tweak it a little bit, and then it will show you the automation lane. If you create an automation, let's say in the span of 2 bars, I'm gonna go from silence to max volume. It will show me the automation lane, as you can see. If we have automation mode off, the automation is still happening, but you cannot see it. For me, the easiest way of working is having the automation view always enabled, because this way I can always see what every single plugin and every single knob is doing. So if I have any kind of problem in my mix, I can immediately figure out what caused it. So that's really cool. The other little button here is an automation lock, which means when you're copy pasting audio samples or MIDI clips or just duplicating them, the automations won't copy over, so you can just copy paste the source material. Down on the far right, you can turn all of these buttons on. This will let you see everything. I/O means you will be able to see the inputs and outputs of a channel. For example, this channel has no inputs, so it will just basically play everything that you put here. And master means it goes straight into the master, so it doesn't go into any other channel. It doesn't go into a group or anything. It goes straight down to the master. In some cases, you want to route your channels to somewhere else, but we're going to talk about that later. R stands for return tracks, which we deleted for now because they will just confuse you and they are not necessary for music production. M will show you your channel controls. So channel controls as in volume slider, your on-off switch, your track solo, and the little balance thing. D will show you your channel delay, which you don't have to touch right now, but it's really handy to give some channels, or in some instances, a whole group some groove. Because if you delay a channel, for example, a super rhythmical one like the main rhythm, you delay it by like 40 milliseconds, that can create a pretty natural sounding groove. You can see it right here. This is the amount set. You can set it to minus or plus. The last and probably the most important area is the bottom bar, where you will be able to see your plugins and sample controls, and the MIDI section. We are obviously talking about this window right here. I'm gonna explain the signal flow to you, which is not that complicated, so bear with me. In Ableton, just like in every other DAW, you have samples and synthesizers. A synthesizer in your DAW is 99% similar to a real-life synthesizer. You have to feed it some sort of data in order to make noise. So this data is usually done with MIDI. If you don't have a MIDI controller, you can still do that in Ableton with your standard keyboard. If you press M on your keyboard, this little piano icon just lit up. When you have that enabled, the A to L row on your keyboard will turn into a MIDI keyboard. So whenever you press a key, it will act like a piano keystroke, like a MIDI keystroke. If I open up a synthesizer such as Serum, if it doesn't happen automatically, you will need to arm the track. Arming the track means you can decide which track you want to send MIDI information to. If I'm arming this track with the button right beside the solo button, I can press anything on my keyboard and it will make a noise. In order to make these permanent, you could play up the things you want it to play later in the track, but we are dubstep producers, so we're not gonna do that. We're just gonna highlight an area. You can just highlight it with left click and then press Ctrl-Shift-M. This only works on a MIDI track. And this will create an empty MIDI track for us. If you double click the MIDI title bar, you can even set a name for it. Let's call it Tips and Tricks. You don't have to name these. I just named it. Control R is renaming everything in Ableton. So Control R, you can rename a channel. Control R, you can rename a preset, anything. So when you double click it, it will open up the MIDI editor. Down here, you will see a piano roll. And if you play anything, you'll see that it shows up. So if you found anything useful, you can just type it in here. Now, how do you type on here? First of all, set the grid size, because that's going to determine your base MIDI note length. So if I double click, it will be this length because the grid size is that. You can right click and select your grid size or just set something adaptive. Adaptive will change with the zoom. So if you zoom in, it's gonna be shorter. If you zoom out, it's gonna be larger. However, you can still control these pretty easily on the edges. If you put these down, these will act like a key press. So now you don't have to press anything. You can just press space for play and they will drive MIDI to the synthesizer, which will generate noise here. After it exits Serum, you can slap on any kind of plugin that you want, and the signal goes from left to right. This is the most important. It goes from here to here to here. And after the last effects output, it will go from the channel to the output set here. The end result is 9 out of 10 times always the master. So from the master, it goes to your headphones. Another disclaimer here, most DAWs like this work on a 32-bit floating point system. What that means is, even if you touch red up here on the channel itself, let's say we distorted every channel like crazy and we have a giant group and it goes above 0, it's not gonna distort if you pull it back with effects on the master. So you're only distorting if you have any kind of distortion plugin or plugin that clips the signal, plugin that saturates the signal, or you overdrive the master itself. Now, if you go above 0 on the master, that will distort. But in here, technically you're not distorting. So now that we know the base signal flow of Ableton, let's check out the super useful and important shortcuts. I'm just gonna rush through these and I'm gonna show what they do in the background. Pressing M will toggle keyboard piano MIDI function. If you are in this mode, XY will act as an octave switcher. C and V will act like velocity switches. If you have any type of sample library based plugins such as Contact, you can usually control the strength of an instrument with the velocity. So the lower the velocity number on a MIDI note, the softer the instrument is gonna play. Control E is cutting a sample or cutting MIDI. You can just click in, Control E, and then it will be cut. Or if you wanna be more precise, you can just highlight an area that you want and then press Ctrl E. It will make cuts at the edges of the selection. And this works with audio as well. So if I take this 808, for example, I can just highlight, cut, move away. You can hold F to enable clip fades. So if you disable MIDI and hold F, it will create handlebars for you, which you can use to fade edges. You can hold Control before dragging a sample, or even after you dragged it, you just hold it and let go of left click and it will copy and move instead of just moving it. Control D is for duplication, which works for channels, MIDI files, MIDI notes, samples, and automations. Control G is grouping effects or grouping channels. When you're tweaking parameters, you can hold Shift to make the tweaks more precise. This will slow down your cursor movement and it will drastically improve accuracy. For example, if you're trying to set a certain amount of semitones for a pitch shifter or anything like that. Clicking on a parameter and pressing delete or double clicking it will reset it. If you are making automations, you can just left click to make a point, left click to delete. If you have 2 points, you can hold Alt to bend the automation. You can also click this little plus icon that will put the automation lane on its new track, so you can always see it. But disclaimer here, a lot of people mistake the waveform here to be like a doubled version of the original. This is not actually audio, this is just a waveform representation so that you know where your automations are exactly in relation to the sample. You can also highlight certain sections and hold Shift to precisely pull an automation lane down. You can also, with supported plugins, you can also right click on a point and add a concrete value. So if I want 500 milliseconds, I just type 500 and it will jump to 500. If you don't find your desired automation, you tweak something else and your automation lane disappeared, you can hold Alt and click the plus. This will open up all the existing automation lanes. Holding Alt and clicking something applies to most things. For example, closing a channel with holding Alt will close all the channels. Opening it will open up all the channels as well if you hold Alt. The standard hotkeys work on Ableton as well. So Control C, Control V is copy paste, Control Z is undo, Control Y is redo. Creating an audio channel is Control T. Creating a MIDI channel is Control Shift T. Now be aware, your Ableton won't open with Serum. This is something I set up. You can set this up too, it's pretty easy, but by default, if you press Control T, it will just open up a blank MIDI channel with no synthesizer on it. If you want to set it up this way, you have to create a new MIDI track, put Serum on it with the stock settings you want to save, and then right click on the channel and click Save as Default MIDI Track. Now every time after this point you open up a MIDI track, it will open up with the synthesizer you set it up with. Control Shift M creates the empty MIDI clip. Let's say you want to make your build double the length and you already have your drop and the rest of the song made. You definitely don't want to cut everything and push everything to the right. There's an easier way of doing it. Just click where you want to insert space, press Ctrl I. This window will open up saying set time to insert. The first column here is the actual number of bars. If you want to extend your build up, let's just say with 8 bars, you just type 8, press OK, and it will insert 8 bars. The opposite of this is Ctrl Shift Delete. So if you highlight an area and press Ctrl Shift Delete, it will delete that time segment. So everything that was in this 8 bars will be gone and everything on the right will be slid up to the beginning of the original selection. Ctrl S is save, Ctrl Shift S is save as, Ctrl Shift R is render/export. There's this really important thing that I abuse a lot, which is Ctrl J, which is kind of like a render in place, but it excludes the effects. So for example, if I want to create a snare roll, I can just zoom in, make something like this, and then highlight them with clicking the first one, holding Shift, clicking the last one, you know, standard selection, and then pressing Ctrl J. This will consolidate these, but my effects are gonna stay here. They are not changing. So this is only freezing this on a sample level. Now you can use clip fades on this as a giant sample, or better yet, you can go into the sample editor and automate it here. You can also use Ctrl J to consolidate MIDI clips. Press 0 to deactivate a clip. This is really important because this way, if you have a variation that you are not absolutely 100% sure about, you can just press 0 and it will deactivate the clip. Works with MIDI clips too and MIDI notes as well. You can easily just press 0 again and reactivate it. This is really handy because you don't have to delete them and then do it again. You can just quickly deactivate it if you don't need it. Ctrl L will loop a selection. Dragging something on the timeline usually snaps to the grid, but if you already grabbed it and then press Alt, it will make it free from the grid, so you can set it to a super tiny amount ahead of everything, or if you want to be extra precise, you can set drums up perfectly if you want to do something creative with a rhythm. If you have warping turned on a sample, you can hold Shift and stretch it, and Alt works the same way here as well. So if you already grabbed it with Shift, you can press Alt and then you can stretch it without the grid. If you have a long sample and you want to scrub in it, you can hold Control Shift and then drag the waveform, not the title bar, and then you can move it as well. This also snaps to the grid, so if you're holding Control Shift and dragging the waveform, press Alt with everything else all together, and then you can move the waveform freely from the grid. A is automation view toggle. If you don't have MIDI enabled, S is solo on the most recent track. Tab is switching between session view and arrangement view. You probably won't ever need this if you're not performing live, so if you're just making music, stick with this in the beginning at least. Control 1 makes the grid size more dense. Control 2 makes it less dense. Control 3 makes it triplet, so it's going to be 3 equally spaced beats in a bar, not 4. Control 4 turns on and off the grid. B enables draw mode. I never use this because it usually snaps to the grid. I don't know, it's just not my workflow, but you can draw in your automations that way or your MIDI that way. And there's one more thing that is important in my opinion, is this section right here. If you have a couple of effects on here and you don't seem to find your effects, you don't know how to open it up, you can double click the title bar of the channel or just go to the bottom right and click here. You can toggle in between sample or MIDI and your effects. This covers most of the basics. Let me know in the comments if you have any more questions regarding basics and tips and tricks on Ableton. I'm sure if not me, someone will answer your question and you can start producing. You can start barfing your ideas into the world. Thank you for watching and see you guys in the next video. Okay. I'm changing this back to 100% because I'm getting claustrophobic. If you found this video helpful, don't forget to check out my website for a lot of high quality Serum and Vital presets and drum samples. You can also support me on Patreon, where I upload bass music specific tutorial content every single month. Peace.